December 7, 1941. Ota District, Tokyo, Japan. Through his office window, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto could observe the Imperial Palace grounds illuminated by the morning sun. Celebrations burst out in the streets below as news of the Pearl Harbor assault spread throughout the capital. Over the previous 12 hours, Japanese carrier-based aircraft had struck Pearl Harbor with crushing accuracy. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, 2,400 Americans killed, 350 aircraft destroyed. The operation had been a tactical triumph. Japanese naval aviators had achieved total surprise, carrying out their mission with remarkable skill and bravery. Yet Yamamoto remained alone in his office, gripped by foreboding rather than elation. While military commanders and government officials celebrated what they believed was a decisive blow to American naval strength, Yamamoto understood a reality that would shadow him until his death. This attack, which appeared to be Japan's greatest success, would ultimately become the trigger for Japan's unavoidable defeat. He had spent years in the United States, more time than any senior Japanese officer of his generation. He had toured the steel mills of Pittsburgh, where blast furnaces produced more steel in a single day than some Japanese plants generated in a month. He had driven past the vast automobile factories of Detroit, observing assembly lines that turned out vehicles with an efficiency Japanese industry could not rival. He had witnessed the agricultural richness of California's Central Valley, where farms generated food surpluses capable of feeding millions. While Japanese agriculture struggled to sustain its own population, Yamamoto knew what his peers refused to accept. America possessed an industrial capacity beyond Japanese understanding. The arithmetic of war that his colleagues celebrated would soon become the arithmetic of Japan's destruction. What none of them grasped, what they refused to acknowledge even when confronted with evidence, was that this strike would unleash the fastest industrial mobilization in human history. A transformation so sweeping that within 6 months, American output would overturn every assumption Japanese war planners had made about their adversaries' capabilities. The sleeping giant phrase later associated with this moment was apocryphal, but the sentiment was genuine. Once awakened, America would prove impossible to restrain. The unraveling of Japanese strategic assumptions began not with a battlefield defeat but with a single presidential address. On January 6, 1942, 30 days after Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress to deliver his State of the Union message. He announced production targets that Japanese intelligence officers monitoring the speech would later dismiss as propaganda, unrealistic figures intended solely to boost American morale. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 125,000 in 1943, 45,000 tanks in 1942, 75,000 more in 1943, 20,000 anti-aircraft guns in 1942, 35,000 in 1943, 6 million tons of merchant shipping in 1942, 10 million tons in 1943. These were not annual targets as Japanese analysts first assumed. Roosevelt was outlining a 2-year production plan, but even when correctly understood, the goals seemed fantastical. For perspective, Japan had produced roughly 5,000 aircraft in 1941. The United States had manufactured approximately 19,000 military aircraft that same year, nearly 4 times Japanese output even before mobilization began. The disparity was already significant, yet Roosevelt was demanding increases that would eclipse anything previously witnessed. Consider the numbers. Roosevelt called for 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 12 times Japan's 1941 production and more than 3 times America's own output the previous year. The entire Japanese aircraft industry operating at full capacity, with every factory running multiple shifts, produced roughly the same output as a single American state. Japanese planners simply could not envision industrial power on the scale Roosevelt described. Yamamoto had cautioned against this very outcome. In 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, he held a confidential conversation with Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono. The precise date remains debated among historians, with sources ranging from early 1940 to November 1941. However, the substance of Yamamoto's warning is well recorded. If ordered to fight, I can promise a fierce struggle for the first 6 months, but I have no confidence in what will happen if the war lasts 2 or 3 years. The admiral's warning was disregarded. The Army General Staff dismissed his concerns as weakness, as defeatism unworthy of a warrior. They believed American society was too soft, too fractured, too decadent to mobilize for total war. They cited isolationism, labor unrest, racial divisions, and political discord as proof that the United States lacked the cohesion and discipline required for modern warfare. They were disastrously mistaken. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, the American industrial apparatus began a transformation that would redefine modern warfare and set new benchmarks for national mobilization. The War Production Board was established on January 16, 1942, exactly 40 days after the attack. Its chairman, Donald Nelson, a former Sears executive with no military background, was granted authority unprecedented in American peacetime history. He could seize factories, redirect raw materials, impose production quotas, and convert entire industries almost overnight. His power, derived from the War Powers Act, was nearly absolute in matters of industrial output. The pace of conversion astonished even Americans who understood their nation's industrial strength. General Motors, the world's largest automaker and a symbol of American manufacturing might, produced its final civilian automobile on February 10, 1942, 64 days after Pearl Harbor. The vehicle, a Chevrolet sedan, left the assembly line at noon. By midnight, that same line was being retooled for tank production. By March 1, the massive Willow Run facility outside Detroit, constructed by Ford specifically to build B-24 Liberator bombers, had begun operations. The plant was so immense it maintained its own railway network, power station, and fire brigade. At peak output, Willow Run completed one bomber every 63 minutes. Ford, Chrysler, Studebaker, Packard, every major American automobile manufacturer halted civilian production entirely. Factories that had produced 4.5 million cars in 1941, satisfying America's appetite for personal transportation and symbolizing its way of life, manufactured precisely 0 civilian vehicles for the duration of the war. Instead, they produced tanks, aircraft engines, artillery shells, machine guns, and military vehicles in quantities Japanese planners had deemed mathematically impossible given America's pre-war industrial base. The automobile industry's conversion illustrates American industrial adaptability. A plant that manufactured car engines could, with modest retooling, produce aircraft engines. Workers who assembled transmissions could be retrained to assemble tank drivetrains. The underlying industrial framework, the machine tools, skilled labor, management structures, and supply networks, could be redirected toward military production with remarkable speed. Japan possessed no comparable flexibility. Its military production was concentrated in specialized facilities that could not be easily converted or expanded. When a Japanese aircraft factory was damaged by bombing, it could not be rapidly rebuilt or replaced. When American factories reached capacity, new ones were constructed within months. The scale of American output began overwhelming Japanese expectations almost immediately. In 1942, American factories produced 47,000 military aircraft, short of Roosevelt's ambitious target of 60,000, yet still nearly 10 times Japan's annual output of about 5,000. By 1943, production rose to 85,000 aircraft, missing the goal of 125,000 but still exceeding the total number of aircraft worldwide just a decade earlier. These included not only fighters and bombers, but also transports, reconnaissance aircraft, trainers, gliders, and specialized types Japan produced only in limited numbers. In 1944, American aircraft production peaked at 96,000 units. By the end of the war in 1945, cumulative American production reached 297,000 military aircraft. Japan, mobilizing its entire industrial base and enduring severe civilian deprivation, produced 85,611 aircraft between 1941 and 1945. The American to Japanese production ratio exceeded 3-to-1, sustained over 4 years of maximum effort by both nations. The difference was not merely numerical but fundamental, reflecting two distinct approaches to industrial warfare. America fought a war of material abundance, accepting losses to accidents, mechanical failure, and enemy action, confident that replacements would arrive faster than they could be destroyed. Japan fought a war of scarcity, carefully rationing resources, unable to replace losses, and watching its strength diminish month after month, regardless of tactical successes. But the transformation went far beyond simple numbers on production charts. It represented a fundamental reorganization of American society that Japanese observers found incomprehensible. Boeing's Seattle plant provides an illustrative example. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, the facility employed 4,000 workers producing aircraft at a modest pace. By the war's peak, the plant employed 30,000 workers, operating 3 shifts per day, 7 days per week. The workforce had increased sevenfold in less than 3 years. Similar expansions occurred at every major defense contractor across America. Where did these workers come from? From every segment of American society. Women who had comprised less than 1% of aircraft. Industry workers before the war made up over 10% by mid-1942. By March 1943, women comprised 30% of aviation manufacturing employees. By 1945, women made up 65% of the aircraft industry workforce in some facilities. The iconic Rosie the Riveter was not propaganda. She was economic reality, representing millions of women who left homes and entered factories to support the war effort. These women were not merely supplemental labor filling clerical roles or light assembly work. They were primary workers performing every task previously reserved for men. They welded fuselages, riveted wing sections, assembled complex engines, operated heavy machinery, read blueprints, performed quality control inspections. They worked swing shifts and graveyard shifts. They raised children, managed households, and worked 48-hour weeks in defense plants. Without them, American production goals would have been impossible to achieve. African means systematically excluded from skilled industrial work in peacetime America through both formal discrimination and informal barriers. Found new employment opportunities in defense plants. Executive Order 8802, signed by Roosevelt in June 1941, prohibited racial discrimination in defense industries. While discrimination certainly continued in practice, the manpower demands of total war forced American industry to tap labor pools previously excluded. By 1945, over 1 million African Americans worked in defense industries, gaining skills, earning wages, and developing expectations of equality that would fuel the post-war civil rights movement. Teenagers left high schools to work in factories with special programs allowing students to work half-days while continuing education. The elderly came out of retirement, bringing experience and work ethic to factories desperate for skilled labor. Disabled individuals found employment in positions suited to their capabilities. The massive labor mobilization drew upon every available person in American society. By 1944, over 18 million Americans worked in defense-related industries. Nearly 1 in 7 people in the entire nation. The Liberty Ship program exemplified American industrial capacity and innovative manufacturing approaches. These cargo vessels, designed to be built quickly with semi-skilled labor using standardized components, began rolling off production lines at unprecedented rates. The most famous example was the SS Robert E. Perry, built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California. This record was deliberately set as an incentive demonstration with experienced workers, stockpiled materials, and special preparations. It was far faster than normal construction times, which averaged 42 to 50 days per ship. But even the normal pace was remarkable by historical standards. Ships that previously took months to build were being launched in weeks. At peak production in 1943, American shipyards launched 3 Liberty ships per day, 18 merchant vessels per week, 75 per month. By war's end, America would produce 27 10 Liberty ships, each one carrying 10,000 tons of cargo, together representing more shipping capacity than existed in the entire Japanese merchant marine at the war's start. Japan's entire merchant ship construction program, operating at maximum wartime capacity, produced approximately 15 ships per month at peak. The disparity was overwhelming and strategically decisive. Consider the strategic implications of this shipping disparity. America could sustain military operations across 2 oceans, simultaneously supplying forces in Europe and the Pacific, maintaining civilian prosperity at home, and sending massive aid to allies, including Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. Japan could barely maintain supply lines to its own frontline forces and saw its merchant marine systematically destroyed by American submarines. By 1945, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to approximately 10% of its pre-war tonnage, strangling Japanese industry of raw materials and military forces of supplies. The mathematical impossibility of Japanese victory became clear to any analyst willing to examine production statistics objectively. But Japanese military leadership refused to acknowledge reality. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Gender, one of the principal architects of the Pearl Harbor attack and one of Japan's most brilliant aviation tacticians, wrote in his diary. In March 1942. Barely 3 months into the war, we achieved tactical surprise, but I fear we have guaranteed strategic defeat. The Americans are not collapsing as we predicted. They are building. They are angry. They are unified. His concerns were noted by superiors and Gender was quietly removed from strategic planning duties. The military leadership did not want officers who questioned inevitable victory. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, 5 months after Pearl Harbor, demonstrated the first significant check to Japanese expansion. For the first time since the war began, a Japanese invasion force was turned back without achieving its objectives. The Imperial Japanese Navy had planned to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea, establishing airbases within striking distance of Australia and completing Japan's defensive perimeter. American and Australian naval forces intercepted the invasion fleet, leading to history's first aircraft carrier battle, where opposing ships never came within visual range of each other. The tactical results were roughly even. The light carrier was sunk and the fleet carrier Shikaku was badly damaged. The American carrier Lexington was sunk and Yorktown was damaged. But the strategic implications favored America. More significantly than ship losses, the Japanese lost 90 aircraft and 77 pilots. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, these pilot losses were catastrophic. Japanese naval aviation training programs were lengthy, demanding, and produced relatively few graduates. Replacing 77 experienced pilots required a year or more, assuming training. Facilities and fuel were available, which they increasingly were not. These losses, which would have been acceptable attrition rates in a war against an equal power, were unsustainable against American production capacity. While Japan struggled to build replacement aircraft, train new pilots, and repair damaged carriers, American factories and flight schools operated 24 hours a day. New American pilots were completing training every week. New American aircraft were rolling off assembly lines every hour. The attrition equation favored America overwhelmingly. Then came Midway, June 4 through 7. 1942, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, precisely as Admiral Yamamoto had predicted, the battle would prove the turning point of the Pacific War, not because of American tactical superiority, which was questionable, but because it revealed the strategic vulnerability that American production capacity would exploit relentlessly for the next 3 years. Admiral Yamamoto had committed 4 fleet carriers to the Midway operation: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiyu. These vessels represented the core of Japanese naval airpower, the same carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor. Their pilots were the most experienced in the world, veterans of operations in China, Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean. They had trained together for years, achieving levels of coordination and skill that American aviators, many with only months of training, could not match. Japanese naval aviation was plane for plane and pilot for pilot, superior to anything America could field in mid-1942. None of this mattered when American dive bombers arrived over the Japanese carriers at the critical moment. American coderreakers operating from a basement facility at Pearl Harbor had cracked Japanese naval codes and provided Admiral Chester Nimitz with remarkably detailed information about Japanese plans. Nimitz positioned 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown in ambush positions northeast of Midway Island. The Japanese, expecting surprise, sailed into a trap. The battle itself was decided in 5 minutes on the morning of June 4. 3 squadrons of American dive bombers arriving over the Japanese carriers by chance rather than coordination found 3 carriers with their decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft being prepared for strikes. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit by multiple bombs and transformed into infernos within minutes. Fuel lines ruptured. Bomb magazines exploded. Armed aircraft on deck detonated. The carriers, which had been Japan's premier naval assets hours earlier, became flaming wrecks that had to be scuttled. Hiu, operating separately, launched a counterattack that crippled the American carrier Yorktown, but was itself discovered and destroyed later that day. In a single day of combat, Japan lost 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers and between 248 and 320 aircraft, depending on how losses are calculated. 110 pilots died, representing just under 25% of the total aircrew embarked on the 4 carriers. These pilots were irreplaceable. Their experience, their training, their institutional knowledge was lost permanently. American losses were significant. The carrier Yorktown was sunk by a Japanese submarine days after the battle. The destroyer Hammond, alongside Yorktown providing damage control assistance, was also sunk. 307 American servicemen died. But the strategic mathematics were what mattered. America lost 1 carrier. Japan lost 4. America could replace carriers faster than Japan could train pilots to fly from them. Japan could not replace either carriers or pilots at rates necessary to sustain attrition warfare. The implications were catastrophic for Japanese strategy and became clearer with each passing month. In the 3 years following Midway from June 1942 to June 1945, Japan would complete 6 new carriers. America would complete 17 Essex-class carriers during the same period. Each one larger, faster, and more capable than its Japanese counterparts. Each class carrier displaced 33,000 tons, carried 90 to 100 aircraft, and incorporated damage control features that made them extraordinarily difficult to sink. They were marvels of naval architecture and industrial production. But carrier production was only one measure of the industrial disparity that Midway had revealed. American shipyards, aircraft factories, pilot training programs, and every other element of naval aviation were scaling up exponentially, while Japanese capacity remained essentially static or actually declined as resources became scarce and factories were damaged by bombing. The mathematical inevitability of Japanese defeat became clearer with each month's production figures. Consider the aircraft production comparison in detail. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, Japan had produced approximately 5,000 aircraft, while America built approximately 19,000, a ratio of nearly 4:1, favoring America. In 1942, American production reached 47,000 while Japan managed approximately 20,000, widening the gap to more than 2:1. In 1943, America produced 85,000 aircraft while Japan built approximately 28,000, a ratio of 3:1. The gap continued widening throughout the war. By war's end, America had produced 297,000 military aircraft total. Japan had built 85,611 aircraft during the entire war from 1937 through 1945 if you include pre-Pearl Harbor production. The cumulative ratio was more than 3:1 sustained across years of maximum mobilization by both nations. But simple ratios understate the disparity because American aircraft were on average larger, more complex, longer ranged, and more heavily armed than Japanese aircraft. The B-29 Superfortress represented far more industrial capacity than a Zero fighter. Yet both count as single aircraft in production. Statistics. The disparity extended to every category of war production, revealing systematic American industrial dominance across all measures. Tanks provide perhaps the starkest comparison. America produced 86,000 Tanks during World War II, including 33,000 Sherman medium tanks, the primary American armored vehicle in both Europe and the Pacific. Japan produced approximately 6,500 tanks over the same period, and most of these were light tanks weighing less than 20 tons, unsuitable for combat against American mediums weighing 30 tons. The Type 97 Shiha, Japan's most numerous medium tank, weighed 15 tons, carried a 57mm gun, and had armor protection of only 25 mm at maximum thickness. The Sherman, in contrast, weighed 30 tons, mounted a 75 gun, and had 50mm frontal armor. In any engagement between these vehicles, the Sherman had overwhelming advantages in firepower, protection, and mobility. But even if Japanese tanks had been technically equal, which they were not, the numerical disparity of 13-1 meant that Japanese armor was effectively irrelevant in the Pacific theater. American tanks could be deployed in overwhelming numbers, ensuring victory through sheer quantity, even when qualitative differences favored Japan. American factories built 2 million military trucks during the war. Japan manufactured approximately 165,000 trucks. The ratio of more than 12-1 reflects fundamentally different approaches to military logistics. American forces were highly mobile, with infantry divisions possessing thousands of trucks for transport and supply. Japanese forces relied heavily on railroads, coastal shipping, and human porters for logistics. When American forces cut Japanese supply lines, Japanese troops often found themselves immobilized and starving. American forces with abundant trucks and well-organized supply chains maintained operational tempo and combat effectiveness, even in remote locations. American shipyards launched approximately 6,800 naval vessels during the war, including aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and auxiliary vessels. Japan completed fewer than 1,000 naval vessels. The disparity was overwhelming in every category. America built 24 Essex-class fleet carriers. Japan completed 6 fleet carriers after Midway. America built over 400 destroyer escorts for convoy protection. Japan built fewer than 70 escort vessels. America launched approximately 200 submarines. Japan built approximately 170, but American submarines proved far more effective in commerce raiding and ultimately destroyed Japanese merchant shipping. The submarine war in the Pacific demonstrates how industrial capacity translated directly into strategic results. American submarines, operating from bases in Pearl Harbor, Australia, and later the Philippines, systematically destroyed Japanese merchant shipping. By war's end, American submarines had sunk approximately 60% of all Japanese merchant vessels and 30% of the Japanese Navy. This maritime blockade starved Japanese industry of oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, iron ore from the Philippines, and food from throughout the empire. Japan's war economy collapsed not from lack of will, but from lack of raw materials that could no longer be transported safely. Japan began the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By August 1945, less than 10% remained operational. Japan could not replace these losses because shipyards were operating at reduced capacity due to material shortages and bomb damage. America was building merchant ships faster than Japanese submarines could possibly sink them. And Japanese submarines focused on warships rather than merchant vessels anyway. A strategic mistake that squandered one of Japan's few potentially effective weapons. But raw numbers only partially explained the industrial chasm that separated the combatants. American production was not merely larger in scale. It was fundamentally different in character, representing a level of industrial integration, technological sophistication, and organizational efficiency that Japan could not match with available resources and technology. The B-29 Superfortress bomber exemplifies this difference better than any other single weapons system. The B-29 was designed specifically to strike Japan from distant bases, addressing the strategic problem of how to attack Japanese home islands when carriers could not safely operate in range and island bases were not yet available. Boeing designed the aircraft to carry heavy bomb loads across 3,000 miles. Distances at altitudes above 30,000 feet, higher than most Japanese fighters could effectively operate. The resulting aircraft was the most complex bomber of World War II and possibly the most sophisticated production aircraft built by any nation during the war. Each B-29 contained 40,540 different parts from massive engine components to tiny electrical switches. The aircraft consumed 12 tons of aluminum in its construction, along with substantial quantities of copper, steel, rubber, and exotic materials like magnesium that Japan could barely obtain. 4 Wright 3350 engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, powered the bomber to operating speeds of 350 miles per hour at 30,000-foot altitude. The pressurized cabin allowed crew members to operate in normal clothing rather than bulky heated flight suits. Remote controlled gun turrets aimed by sophisticated analog computers provided defensive armament. The B-29 carried up to 20,000 pounds of bombs, equivalent to the total bomb load of 20 fighters across distances of 3,000 miles. It struck targets that had previously been safe from air attack, bringing war directly to Japanese cities and industry. America would build approximately 4,000 of these bombers between 1943 and 1945. Each one represented industrial capacity and technological sophistication that exceeded Japan's entire aircraft industry output. The fact that America could produce 4,000 B-29s while simultaneously building thousands of fighters, medium bombers, transports, and other aircraft types reveals the scale of American industrial mobilization. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan demonstrated both American production capacity and the futility of Japanese resistance once American industry reached full mobilization. The campaign began in earnest in November 1944 when B-29 bombers based in the Marana Islands began regular attacks on Japanese industrial targets. Initial raids used high-altitude precision bombing attempting to destroy specific factories. Results were disappointing due to weather, navigation difficulties, and Japan's dispersed industrial base. In March 1945, Major General Curtis Lane changed tactics, ordering low-altitude nighttime incendiary raids against Japanese cities. The results were devastating. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9 to 10, 1945 employed 334 B-29 bombers carrying 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs designed to start uncontrollable fires in densely packed wooden structures. The attack created a firestorm that destroyed 16 square miles of Tokyo, killing approximately 100,000 people in a single night, more casualties than would result from the atomic bombing of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The firestorm created temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to boil water in canals and melt glass. People who sought refuge in water were boiled alive. Those who remained in buildings were incinerated. Those who fled into streets were suffocated by smoke or consumed by fire. The destruction was comprehensive and horrifying, exceeding anything that conventional bombing had previously achieved. Yet, this massive raid, which killed more people than any other single air attack in history up to that point, represented only a fraction of American bombing capability. Within weeks, similar raids struck Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, Yokohama, and dozens of smaller cities throughout Japan. By summer 1945, Japan's major urban areas had been systematically destroyed. American bombers were dropping leaflets warning specific cities of impending attacks, then returning days later to destroy them exactly as promised. This psychological warfare demonstrated that Japan had lost not only the physical capacity to defend itself, but also the ability to protect civilians from assault. Japanese fighter defenses, already depleted by years of attrition, could not prevent American bombers from operating with near impunity over Japanese territory. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, occurring exactly 2 years after Midway, demonstrated how completely American production had overcome Japanese tactical skill. The battle occurred during the American invasion of the Marana Islands, strategically vital because their capture would place B-29 bombers within range of Japan. The Japanese Navy launched Operation AGO, committing 9 carriers and supporting vessels in an attempt to destroy American carrier forces and prevent the Marana's invasion. Japanese naval aviation, which had been the world's finest in 1941, had been systematically destroyed through 2 years of attrition warfare. Experienced pilots killed in earlier battles had been replaced by hastily trained recruits with minimal flight time and no combat experience. These new pilots flying against American carrier groups that had expanded exponentially since Midway were slaughtered in what American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. On June 19, 1944, Japanese carrier aircraft launched massive strikes against American carriers. American fighter defenses, guided by radar and coordinated by experienced fighter directors, intercepted Japanese formations. The result was catastrophic for Japan. More than 600 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in a single day, shot down by fighters or anti-aircraft fire. American losses were approximately 30 aircraft. The exchange ratio exceeded 20-1 favoring America. For Japan, the loss of 600 aircraft in one day was catastrophic beyond imagination. American aircraft industry could replace 600 planes in less than a week of peak production. Japan required months to build that many aircraft, assuming materials and labor were available, which increasingly they were not. More critically, the pilots flying those aircraft were irreplaceable. Japan had no way to train hundreds of carrier pilots quickly. The few training facilities still operating lacked fuel, experienced instructors, and operational aircraft for student training. The Battle of the Philippine Sea effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation as a significant force. From that point forward, Japanese carriers operated without adequate aircraft or pilots. At the Battle of Lee Gulf in October 1944, Japanese carriers served primarily as decoys carrying few aircraft and intended only to draw American carriers away from the invasion beaches. The strategy failed and Japanese naval power was effectively destroyed. By war's end, the Imperial Japanese Navy existed largely on paper, with surviving ships immobilized in harbors for lack of fuel. Women's role in American production deserves particular emphasis because it represented social mobilization that Japanese planners had not anticipated and could not replicate. In pre-war America, social conventions restricted women primarily to domestic roles or limited employment opportunities in teaching, nursing, secretarial work, and light manufacturing. Heavy industrial work was exclusively male domain. Defense industries employed virtually no women before 1941. Pearl Harbor changed everything. As millions of American men entered military service, defense industries faced critical labor shortages. The War Manpower Commission, established in April 1942, coordinated efforts to recruit women into defense work. The famous Rosie the Riveter recruitment campaign, featuring a determined woman with rolled-up sleeves declaring "we can do it," symbolized the national effort to recruit women into factories. The response was overwhelming. By 1943, over 6 million women worked in defense industries, comprising approximately 35% of the total defense workforce. In aircraft manufacturing, women made up 65% of workers in some facilities. These women performed every job previously reserved for men. They welded fuselages with acetylene torches. They operated massive hydraulic presses forming aluminum sheets. They assembled complex engines with thousands of precisely fitted parts. They read technical blueprints. They performed quality control inspections. They drove forklifts, operated cranes, worked on assembly lines producing everything from bullets to battleships. The social implications were profound and lasting. Women who had never worked outside their homes discovered capabilities they had not known they possessed. They earned wages, gained economic independence, developed skills and confidence. After the war, many returned to domestic roles, but the experience fundamentally changed American society. The women who built B-29s and Liberty ships would raise daughters who demanded equality. The industrial mobilization of World War II planted seeds for the feminist movement of the 1960s and wet and 70s. Japan had no equivalent. Mobilization of female labor. Japanese women certainly contributed to the war. Effort through agricultural work, light manufacturing, and civil defense. But Japanese industrial culture did not adapt to employ women in heavy manufacturing. This was partly cultural, reflecting traditional gender roles that were even more rigid than in pre-war America, but also practical. Japanese factories did not have labor surpluses to recruit from, because Japanese men were not being drafted in numbers comparable to American mobilization. Japan simply lacked the population base and industrial capacity to fight both a total war and maintain industrial production at levels comparable to America. The Manhattan Project represented the ultimate expression of American industrial and scientific capacity. A program so vast and so secret that few Americans knew it existed, even as it employed over 130,000 people. The project cost approximately $2 billion, more than the entire Japanese defense budget for some years of the war. The facilities constructed for the Manhattan Project were themselves industrial marvels. Oak Ridge, Tennessee was built from scratch in 1943 as a uranium enrichment facility. At peak operation, the facility consumed 1/17 of all electrical power generated in the United States, more than New York City. The electromagnetic separation equipment designed to separate fissionable uranium-235 from more common uranium-238 was manufactured by companies that normally produced commercial electrical equipment, but were converted to produce components for atomic weapons. Hanford, Washington, constructed simultaneously, produced plutonium and nuclear reactors that had never been operated at that scale before. The reactors required constant cooling with water from the Columbia River, processed in facilities that were the largest industrial installations in the Pacific Northwest. The entire operation was experimental, based on scientific principles that were barely understood and engineering on scales never attempted. Los Alamos, New Mexico, served as the design laboratory where scientists and engineers designed the actual bombs. J. Robert Oppenheimer directed a team of brilliant scientists, many refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe, working frantically to complete weapons before Germany developed them first. The irony, not known until after the war, was that Germany never came close to building atomic bombs. German atomic research had been abandoned in early 1942 after scientists calculated that weapons development would require resources Germany could not spare from conventional arms production. The scientific knowledge, engineering expertise, and industrial infrastructure required for the Manhattan Project existed nowhere else in the world. Britain had excellent scientists but lacked industrial resources. The Soviet Union had brilliant theoreticians but lacked the technological base. Germany had started ahead but abandoned the effort. Japan had some of the world's best physicists but lacked uranium, industrial capacity, and the organizational resources for a program of necessary scale. Only America possessed all required elements: scientific knowledge, industrial capacity, electrical power, rare materials, engineering expertise, financial resources, and above all, the organizational capability to coordinate efforts across dozens of sites involving hundreds of companies and over 130,000 workers. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, used uranium-235 and detonated with force equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The explosion killed approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people immediately and destroyed 4 square miles of the city. Tens of thousands more would die in subsequent weeks and months from radiation exposure and burns. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, another B-29 dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki. This bomb, called Fat Man, used plutonium and detonated with slightly greater force, approximately 21,000 tons of TNT equivalent. The explosion killed approximately 40,000 to 60,000 people immediately in a city partially shielded by hills that limited blast effects. These attacks demonstrated conclusively that Japan could no longer protect its population from American assault. Emperor Hirohito, speaking publicly for The first time in Japanese history announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. In his radio address, he cited the atomic bombs specifically as justification for surrender, stating that the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable. The formal surrender ceremony occurred on September 2, 1945 aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, ending the Pacific War. The strategic analysis of Japan's defeat reveals that Pearl Harbor, far from being Japan's greatest victory, was actually the trigger for inevitable collapse. Admiral Yamamoto had understood this truth before the attack. His prediction of 6 months of success followed by mounting difficulties proved accurate almost to the day. Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor at June 4 to 7, precisely matching Yamamoto's timeline. From that moment forward, American industrial capacity made Japanese defeat mathematically certain regardless of courage, skill, or sacrifice displayed by Japanese forces. Japanese military planners had made several catastrophic miscalculations, each one compounding the others to create strategic disaster. First, they underestimated American industrial capacity by a factor of 10 or more. They knew America produced more than Japan, but fundamentally misunderstood the scale of potential American mobilization. Second, they assumed American society was too soft, too divided, too decadent to mobilize effectively for total war. They believed Americans loved comfort and would not accept sacrifices necessary for victory. Pearl Harbor proved them disastrously wrong, unifying American public opinion and creating determination to fight until Japan surrendered unconditionally. Third, Japanese planners believed military excellence could compensate for material inferiority. They assumed superior training, fighting spirit, and tactical skill would allow Japanese forces to achieve victory despite inferior numbers. This assumption ignored the mathematics of attrition warfare. Superior training matters in individual combat, but in industrial warfare involving millions of soldiers and tens of thousands of aircraft and ships, quantity has its own quality. American forces could accept losses, learn from mistakes, and return with improved equipment and fresh troops. Japanese forces could not replace losses and watched numerical strength decline month after month. Fourth, Japanese planners gambled that America would negotiate peace after early defeats rather than fight to unconditional surrender. They believed American casualties at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and early battles would create public pressure for negotiated peace that would leave Japan controlling much of its conquered territory. They fundamentally misunderstood American political culture and the determination that Pearl Harbor's surprise attack had created. America fought to unconditional surrender, accepting whatever casualties proved necessary to achieve complete victory. They were wrong on every calculation, and each miscalculation was compounded by Japan's inability to adapt when reality contradicted assumptions. Japanese military leadership, trained in a culture that valued spirit over material considerations, could not accept that industrial production mattered more than fighting spirit. They continued launching offensives even when losses were unsustainable, believing determination would somehow overcome mathematical reality. American production statistics tell the story of systematic industrial mobilization that defeated Japan as surely as bombs and bullets: 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2 million military trucks, approximately 6,800 naval vessels. These numbers represent production achieved while simultaneously fighting Germany and Italy in Europe and North Africa, maintaining civilian standards of living far above subsistence levels, and actually expanding the American economy overall. Between 1941 and 1945, American gross national product increased by approximately 70% while producing enough military equipment to supply not only American forces but also substantial Allied forces including Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and Free French forces. Japan could not remotely approach this output even when devoting all resources to military production and accepting drastic civilian privation. By 1944, Japanese civilians were on subsistence rations. Cities were being evacuated to Reduce food requirements. Industrial production was declining due to lack of raw materials as the American submarine blockade tightened. Yet, American civilians enjoyed relative prosperity. Food remained abundant if rationed, consumer goods remained available if restricted, and American industrial output continued expanding. The human cost of the war was staggering and must be acknowledged even in a narrative focused on industrial production. Japan suffered approximately 2.1 to 2.5 million military deaths and 550,000 to 800,000 civilian deaths with uncertainty due to incomplete records and ongoing debate about casualties from atomic bombings and firebombing. American casualties in the Pacific Theater were approximately 100,000 killed and 300,000 wounded. Significant numbers, but proportionally far smaller than Japanese losses. The disparity in casualties reflects the fundamental reality of the conflict. America could sustain losses and replace them with fresh troops, new equipment, and maintained morale. Japan could not. Every ship sunk, every plane shot down, every soldier killed represented irreplaceable loss for Japan, but temporary setback for America. By 1945, Japan was fielding inexperienced pilots with minimal training, operating damaged aircraft patched together from spare parts, burning alternative fuels made from pine tree roots because petroleum was unavailable. American forces were fielding better trained pilots, flying superior aircraft operating from secure bases with ample supplies. Post-war interviews with Japanese military leaders revealed the psychological impact of American production capacity. General Kawabe Toriro, who served on the Imperial General Staff throughout the war, stated in post-war interrogations that Japanese planners had fundamentally misunderstood American industrial power. He acknowledged that Japan would have needed to increase industrial production 20-fold to match American output, something that was physically impossible given Japan's resource base, industrial technology, labor force, and geographic limitations. The strategic conclusion, he admitted, decades after the war, when hindsight made everything clear, should have been obvious before the war began. America could not be defeated through military force because it possessed industrial capacity that made military victory mathematically impossible. Admiral Yamamoto had known this truth and tried desperately to communicate it to military and political leadership before the war began. He had lived in America from 1925 to 1925. Seven studied at Harvard University, traveled extensively throughout the country, and served as naval HCs in Washington from 1926 to 1928. He understood that American industrial capacity, once mobilized, would prove overwhelming. His famous 6-month prediction was not military analysis based on battle tactics or strategic positioning. It was industrial calculation based on cold mathematics. He knew Japanese forces could achieve tactical victories for approximately 6 months, the time required for American industry to mobilize fully and for the American military to absorb initial setbacks, learn lessons, and return with overwhelming force. After that point, American production would overwhelm Japanese forces through sheer material superiority, regardless of Japanese courage or tactical skill. His prediction proved accurate to the month, and his death in April 1943 meant he did not live to see the complete vindication of his warnings or the utter devastation that his colleagues' refusal to listen had brought upon Japan. The legacy of American production during World War II extended far beyond military victory over Japan and Germany. The factories that built B-29 bombers converted to building commercial airliners, establishing American dominance in aerospace that continues today. The shipyards that launched Liberty ships built container vessels and tankers for global commerce. The industrial capacity mobilized for war production transitioned smoothly to PCE prosperity, establishing America as the world's preeminent economic power for generations. That dominance began with production goals announced 30 days after Pearl Harbor and proved through achievements that exceeded Japan's worst fears. The workers, engineers, and managers who performed this industrial mobilization deserve recognition alongside soldiers who fought in combat zones. They demonstrated that modern warfare required total societal mobilization. That victory came from coordinated effort involving millions of people across entire nations, and that industrial production mattered as much as tactical excellence on battlefields. Women welding Liberty ship hulls in Richmond shipyards contributed as much to victory as Marines landing on beaches at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Engineers designing production systems for rapid aircraft assembly were as important as fighter pilots achieving air superiority over Japanese cities. The entire American homefront mobilized for production in ways that Japanese planners had calculated were impossible in a democratic society where citizens' retained freedom and government power was limited. The story of Pearl Harbor's aftermath is fundamentally about industrial production, resource mobilization, and the triumph of systematic industrial capacity over tactical military excellence. Japan's military forces were superbly trained, tactically proficient, courageous beyond question, and willing to sacrifice everything for victory. Japanese pilots, sailors, and soldiers fought with skill and determination that commanded respect from their enemies. These qualities, as impressive as they were, proved insufficient against an opponent who produced weapons faster than they could be destroyed, ships faster than they could be sunk, and aircraft faster than they could be shot down. Modern warfare, as American production demonstrated conclusively, was decided in factories as much as on battlefields. The nation that could mobilize industry effectively, organize production efficiently, and sustain output indefinitely would defeat opponents regardless of tactical victories or individual heroism displayed in combat. This lesson, learned definitively in the Pacific War, would shape military thinking for generations and drive Cold War competition between America and the Soviet Union in following decades. Today, historians assess Pearl Harbor as one of history's greatest strategic miscalculations, a decision that doomed the nation that made it. Japan attacked an opponent with more than 10 times their industrial capacity, believing that military excellence, fighting spirit, and tactical surprise could overcome material inferiority. They gambled that America would negotiate peace after early defeats rather than mobilize fully and fight to unconditional surrender. They assumed American society was too divided, too soft, too focused on individual comfort to accept sacrifices necessary for total war. They were wrong on every calculation, and the cost of those miscalculations was complete defeat, occupation, atomic bombing, loss of empire, and fundamental transformation of Japanese society and government. The 6 months from Pearl Harbor to Midway demonstrated the speed and completeness of American mobilization. The remaining 3.5 years of war demonstrated the inevitability of American victory once that mobilization achieved full strength and American production reached levels that Japan could neither match nor effectively resist. Roosevelt's production goals? Announced 30 days after Pearl Harbor in his State of the Union address and initially dismissed by Japanese intelligence as propaganda designed for American morale, were largely achieved or exceeded when considered across the 2-year time frame Roosevelt had specified. 60,000 aircraft in 1942 became 47,000, falling short but still nearly 10 times Japanese annual output. 125,000 aircraft in 1943 became 85,000. Missing the target, but still dwarfing enemy production and representing more aircraft than existed in the entire world a decade earlier. The tank goals were met or exceeded across the 2-year period. 45,000 tanks in 1942 plus 75,000. In 1943, totaling 120,000 was approximately achieved, with American factories ultimately producing 86,000 tanks during the entire war. The shipping goals were exceeded dramatically, with American shipyards launching far more tonnage than Roosevelt had requested. The anti-aircraft gun production met or exceeded targets. The story of Japanese expectations versus American industrial reality stands as enduring testament to the danger of misunderstanding your opponent's capabilities, of making strategic decisions based on assumptions rather than facts, and of believing what you wish were true rather than accepting reality. Japan's military planners made calculations based on incomplete information, cultural assumptions that proved false, systematic underestimation of American resolve, and strategic wishful thinking that ignored contrary Evidence. They believed what they wanted to believe, what fits their preconceptions about American weakness and Japanese superiority. Rather than conducting cold mathematical analysis of relative industrial capacity and strategic resources, Admiral Yamamoto, who had lived in America and understood American industrial capacity firsthand, tried desperately to warn them. His warnings were ignored, dismissed as defeatism, treated as lack of fighting spirit. The result was catastrophic defeat, occupation by foreign forces for the first time in Japanese history, atomic bombing, loss of empire, and complete transformation of Japanese government and society. The magnitude of American achievement becomes overwhelmingly clear when examining complete production statistics across all categories. America built 297,000 aircraft while fighting on multiple continents and oceans. Japan built 85,611 aircraft while focusing primarily on one theater. America produced 86,000 tanks. Japan built approximately 6,500. America launched approximately 6,800 naval vessels. Japan completed fewer than 1,000. In every single category of military production, in every measure of industrial output, in every comparison of war-making capacity, the disparity was overwhelming, sustained across 4 years, and ultimately decisive in determining war outcomes. The final verdict on Pearl Harbor's strategic value comes from Japanese sources themselves, from the officers and leaders who planned and executed the attack and lived to see its consequences. Admiral Yamamoto, before his death on April 18, 1943, when his aircraft was shot down by P-38 Lightning fighters flying from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in an ambush enabled by Kodering, had written privately that the attack had been a tactical success but a strategic catastrophe of the first magnitude. It destroyed battleships, impressive targets that made good propaganda, but were increasingly obsolete in carrier warfare, while missing the carriers that would prove decisive. It unified American public opinion, which had been divided between interventionists and isolationists, creating national consensus for total war that might have been impossible to achieve through normal political processes. It guaranteed American entry into war with fury and determination rather than reluctant participation that Japan might have managed through diplomatic means. Most fatally, it awakened American industrial capacity, mobilized American society completely, and triggered the transformation that made Japanese defeat inevitable. The attack that was supposed to American naval power and enable Japanese victory instead guaranteed Japanese defeat by mobilizing an opponent whose industrial capacity, once aroused, proved unstoppable. By striking Pearl Harbor in a surprise attack that Americans perceived as treacherous and dishonorable, Japan triggered the most rapid and complete industrial mobilization in human history. The transformation occurred because American industrial capacity, which Japanese planners had fundamentally misunderstood and systematically underestimated, mobilized with unprecedented speed, achieved unprecedented scale, and operated with unprecedented efficiency. The workers in American factories won the Pacific War as certainly as soldiers in combat zones. The women welding bomber fuselages, the men casting tank armor, the engineers optimizing production lines, the managers coordinating supply chains, every person who contributed to American industrial output from December 1941 through August 1945 helped defeat Japan. The industrial might that shocked Japanese observers and convinced them of inevitable defeat was not propaganda, not exaggeration, not temporary achievement. It was mathematics, cold calculation, systematic mobilization of resources and capabilities that Japan could never match, and it rewrote the strategic balance of the Pacific War in 6 transformative months from December 7, 1941 to June 7, 1942, demonstrating conclusively that modern warfare would be won by industrial capacity as much as military skill, that production mattered as much as tactics, and that nations attacking opponents with vastly superior industrial resources did so at risk of complete destruction. The transformation of American society during this period deserves deeper examination because it represents perhaps history's most complete example of democratic mobilization for total war. Unlike authoritarian regimes that could command sacrifice through force, American mobilization occurred through voluntary participation, economic incentives, patriotic appeals, and social pressure. Defense workers earned good wages, often better than pre-war employment. Women entering factories gained economic independence along with patriotic purpose. African Americans discovered opportunities that had previously been closed to them. Mobilization succeeded not through force, but by aligning personal incentives with national objectives. The War Production Board, led by Donald Nelson and succeeded by Julius Krug in 1944, directed industrial mobilization with striking efficiency given the scope and intricacy of the challenge. The board distributed scarce resources, established production priorities, settled disputes between competing demands, and ensured factories operated at peak output. Its efforts represented economic planning on a scale previously associated only with totalitarian states, yet it functioned within democratic limits, responding to political pressures, bargaining with industrial leaders, and sustaining public support. The accomplishment becomes even more striking when the obstacles overcome are considered. American industry in 1941 was not prepared for wartime production. Plants designed for civilian goods required extensive modification. Workers needed instruction for unfamiliar tasks. Supply networks had to be reorganized. Management systems created for peacetime manufacturing proved insufficient for wartime requirements. Yet within months, American industry reinvented itself entirely, reaching production levels Japanese observers found literally unbelievable. Even when faced with evidence, the pace of transformation surpassed anything Japanese planners had imagined possible. In their assessments of American industrial potential, Japanese analysts assumed that democratic societies with competing interests and limited governmental authority would mobilize slowly and imperfectly. They expected labor disputes to disrupt output, racial tensions to weaken cooperation, and political divisions to block unified action. The speed and cohesion of American mobilization after Pearl Harbor shattered these assumptions completely. Consider the social consequences of this mobilization. Women entering factories in enormous numbers challenged traditional gender expectations and demonstrated abilities that pre-war society had denied or overlooked. African Americans gaining industrial employment and military service confronted racial segregation and planted the foundations for civil rights movements that would reshape American society in the decades that followed. The shared experience of mobilization, working toward common objectives, sacrificing for the collective good, reinforced national identity and demonstrated that democratic societies could mobilize as effectively as authoritarian regimes without abandoning fundamental liberties. The Japanese military leadership's core misunderstanding of American society contributed directly to strategic defeat. They believed democracy signified weakness, that freedom bred decadence, and that individualism prevented collective action. Pearl Harbor proved them catastrophically mistaken. American democracy, galvanized by surprise attack, mobilized more thoroughly and efficiently than Japanese authoritarianism. American individualism, directed toward national purpose, achieved more than Japanese conformity. American diversity, drawing on the talents and energy of every segment of society, outproduced Japanese homogeneity. These lessons extended well beyond World War II, shaping Cold War rivalry and influencing military thought for generations. The nation capable of mobilizing industrial capacity most effectively, organizing production efficiently and sustaining output reliably, would enjoy decisive advantages in prolonged conflict. This realization drove Cold War arms races, space competition, and technological development. The pattern established in the Pacific War, where American industry proved decisive, reappeared during the Cold War, when American economic strength ultimately surpassed Soviet capacity despite Soviet advantages in certain military technologies. The human stories behind the statistics deserve recognition. The teenage girl from Iowa who left high school to weld Liberty ship hulls, earning wages that supported her family and uncovering abilities she never suspected. The African American man from Mississippi who migrated to Detroit and found factory work paying 3 times his sharecropper income, experiencing economic opportunity for the first time. The grandmother from Oregon who returned from retirement to inspect aircraft components, applying decades of experience to quality control that ensured American pilots flew safe aircraft. These individuals, multiplied by millions across the nation, reshaped America and altered world history. They were not soldiers. They did not fire weapons or sea combat. Yet their contributions were as vital to victory as any battle won or island seized. They demonstrated that modern warfare demanded total societal mobilization, that civilians mattered as much as soldiers, and that the home front was as crucial as the battlefield. The legacy of their achievement continues into the present. The industrial foundation they built supported American prosperity for generations. The social changes they initiated, particularly regarding women's roles and racial equality, fundamentally transformed American society. The proof that democratic systems could mobilize effectively provided the ideological basis for Cold War competition and continues to influence debates over governance and social organization. Japan absorbed these lessons through catastrophic defeat, occupation, and profound transformation of society and government. The post-war Japan that emerged became one of the world's most successful democracies and industrial powers, building prosperity through peaceful competition rather than conquest. This transformation occurred in part because Japanese leaders who survived the war understood what had defeated them. They had witnessed American industrial capacity firsthand and recognized that prosperity flowed from production, cooperation, and freedom, not coercion or authoritarian rule. The world learned these lessons by observing American industry reshape warfare itself, establishing principles that would define great power conflict in the industrial age. The 6 months from Pearl Harbor to Midway demonstrated that surprise attacks and tactical brilliance were insufficient against an adversary possessing overwhelming industrial strength. The remaining years of the war showed that once mobilized, American industry could sustain operations across multiple theaters while maintaining civilian prosperity, something no other nation achieved during World War II. The final measure of American achievement appears in comparative statistics. The United States produced roughly 40% of all military equipment manufactured worldwide during World War II, despite accounting for only 6% of the global population. This ratio of output to population, sustained across 4 years of maximum effort, surpassed anything previously achieved and conclusively demonstrated that democratic capitalism could mobilize resources as effectively as any authoritarian system while preserving political freedom and improving civilian living standards. The industrial mobilization that defeated Japan continues to offer lessons about national power, societal resilience, and the sources of strength in modern competition. Physical courage matters, tactical skill matters, strategic intelligence matters, but in prolonged conflicts between industrial powers, production capacity matters most. The nation that can build more, faster, and better will ultimately overwhelm its opponent, regardless of temporary setbacks or individual heroism. Admiral Yamamoto understood this reality and attempted to warn his country. His warnings were ignored, with catastrophic consequences. The attack on Pearl Harbor was intended to cripple American naval power and enable Japanese victory. Instead, it awakened American industrial might and ensured Japan's defeat. The 6 months from December 7, 1941, to June 7, 1942, saw American production surge from peacetime to wartime levels at unprecedented speed. The figures tell a story of systematic mobilization that completely overwhelmed Japanese capacity. In January 1942, only weeks after Pearl Harbor, American factories were already converting to wartime output. By February, automobile production had halted entirely. By March, aircraft production was accelerating rapidly. By April, shipyards were launching vessels at record rates. By May, the Battle of the Coral Sea demonstrated that American naval strength was rebounding. By June, at Midway, American forces struck a blow from which Japan would never recover. Each month delivered new evidence of American industrial power in motion. Each month saw production exceed previous records. Each month confirmed that Roosevelt's seemingly impossible targets were becoming reality. Japanese intelligence officers tracking American output struggled to believe their own data. The numbers appeared impossible, yet they were real, verified, and undeniable. The following 3 years saw production sustained and expanded until victory was achieved completely and irreversibly. American forces advanced across the Pacific, each operation backed by overwhelming material superiority. American submarines strangled Japanese commerce, supported by production that replaced losses faster than Japan could inflict them. American aircraft dominated Pacific skies, destroying Japanese planes in lopsided ratios reflecting both superior training and vastly superior numbers. By 1945, Japan's position was hopeless by any objective standard. Cities burned under strategic bombing, merchant shipping was annihilated, industrial output collapsed, food shortages approached starvation, military forces fought with outdated equipment, insufficient supplies, and dwindling manpower. Yet Japanese leadership refused surrender until atomic weapons demonstrated that America possessed arms against which no defense existed, and that continued resistance meant national destruction. The contrast between Japanese expectations in December 1941 and Japanese reality in August 1945 could not have been sharper. Japan began the war anticipating rapid victories, territorial expansion, and a negotiated peace-preserving imperial power. It ended the war with cities ruined, empire lost, military defeated, and the nation occupied for the first time in its history. This reversal, from confident aggressor to defeated and occupied nation in less than 4 years, was driven primarily by American industrial capacity that exceeded Japanese worst fears and proved impossible to counter. The Pacific War, for all its battles, heroism, innovation, and tactical complexity, was ultimately decided by production. America possessed it. Japan did not. That difference was decisive, determinative, and overwhelming, reshaping the Pacific world, establishing American dominance for generations, and proving that modern wars are won in factories as surely as on battlefields.